MetLife Foundation is pleased to support the following program: Alzheimer's, the help you need. Meeting the challenges of understanding and coping with this urgent health issue. MetLife Foundation, working toward an Alzheimer's cure.
Hello, I'm David Hyde Pierce. I'm a spokesperson and board member of the Alzheimer's Association, and I lost my dad and my grandfather to Alzheimer's. The film that we've just seen is overwhelming, and like any great documentary, it raises as many questions as it answers. I'm joined today by a panel of experts to answer some of those questions for you. And for the questions we can't answer now, we'll point you to resources in your own community where you can get the help you need. With me here is Dr. Stephen Dukosky, Director of the University of Pittsburgh Alzheimer's Research Center, Lisa Gweither, Education Director of the Alzheimer's Research Center at Duke University, Edna Ballard, social worker with the Duke Family Support Program, and David Schenk, the author of the book, The Forgetting, upon which this documentary is based. And we are so lucky to have with us here in the audience tonight also some of the family members who so generously and bravely shared their struggles with us in this documentary. Thank you for being here. The first question I have to ask is David Schenk, because he started this whole thing with his book. Your book inspired this documentary, so my question is, what inspired you to write it? Are you like the rest of us? Do you have a family connection to Alzheimer's disease?
How did I get here? No, I don't have a family connection. I was jolted into this by a conversation I overheard one day about 4.5 years ago now. There was a middle-aged couple in, the woman was in the middle stages of Alzheimer's, I now recognize. The husband was the caregiver. She was still living at home, but she didn't know who her husband was anymore. So they're still physically, ostensibly from the outside, living the life they've lived together as best friends and as mates for 25, 30 years, but it was just a shell. It wasn't really happening. And that idea forced what I now realize to be the terrifying fear I'd always had of Alzheimer's disease from the back of my brain to the front, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. And I just had question upon question. What causes this disease? Where does it come from? How long has it been around? And what are we going to do to cure it?
That's actually a good question. Butch, at the very end of the film, says quite eloquently, stop it, cure it. So my question, Dr. Dukosky, is are we doing that? Can we do that? How goes the war on the research front?
Well, we have some symptomatic drugs that help the disease now. We will probably slow down the disease and hopefully stop it before we cure it. Mm-hmm. For cure, we have some of the same problems that we do with stroke and with severe brain trauma of replacing parts of the brain that have gone away, that have completely disappeared. But slowing it down or stopping it probably is within our reach. We hope the sooner the better.
In the meantime, for those of us who are worried about getting this disease, what are the chances? What are the odds? I've got it in my family. Does that mean that I'm going to get it? Anyone?
Well, certainly a family history puts you at somewhat risk, increased risk, but it doesn't guarantee that you'll get it. We are all at risk of Alzheimer's disease. It could happen to anyone. And I think that's the important thing. Certainly, if you live long enough, you're at greater risk, and that makes a difference. And then there are these rare cases of familial early onset Alzheimer's disease that was illustrated in the film.
I think that's an urgent question. If you have somebody in your family, will I be next? And particularly if you're an adult child. I can remember first being made aware of that when a young man whose father had Alzheimer's disease said to me that I wake up in the night saying my Social Security number over and over and over.
But the flip side of that is also equally important. No one is immune, and this is what I learned early on and made me feel even more urgently this problem need to be addressed. We're all in this boat, every single one of us.
Probably just worthwhile adding, David, that we all have a different risk of developing the disease, but the risk is not a guarantee. So that with the exception of the 150 or 200 families in the world, as those highlighted in David's book, who have a mistake in their gene and are at risk 50% of getting it or not. Most people, as they get older, have increased but different risks. You have an average risk, and then your risk is increased a bit by having someone in the family with it or having some combination of genes that may make it easier for the disease to show itself, but don't guarantee that you will get it.
Right.
And we'd like to be able to take advantage of all of these increased or decreased risks to figure out how to treat it or how to lower everyone's risk.
I think what's interesting about all of this is that whether you have it in your family or you don't, everyone seems to be thinking about this. And I know we have some questions in the audience about this. Julene, where are you?
What are some preventive measures
To hopefully keep from
not
getting
get
it?
it?
Good question.
Great question.
Anyone? Prevention?
Yeah. You can start by taking care of everything else that's going on in your life. If you have hypertension, it's worth treating it. You can also avoid fats. You can exercise. You can keep doing things you feel passionate about. But at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge there are people who did all the right things. You know, in the South, we call it clean living and constant prayer. And they still got Alzheimer's disease, and they were very bright, intelligent people. There are certainly more and more we're learning that some of the lifestyle changes that people make for heart disease can be very helpful in Alzheimer's disease as well.
There are risks, and there are certain things you can do to decrease your risk, and that those particular things aren't terribly difficult to do, and they'll help with heart disease as well. And they may well decrease the overall numbers of people who get the disease.
But this is not a good thing for a control freak who thinks if I just
Right.
do this, I won't get it.
Yeah. No, I think the thing to take away from it is it's better for you regardless. Hopefully this may be helpful with heart disease or Alzheimer's, but the bottom line is if you eat better and exercise more and read more, why not? You'll have a better life.
Just one more reason to do the things that
Yeah.
doctors have been telling us to do.
That we've all been avoiding.
Yeah.
I forget someone's name and immediately think, is this it? Happens to me, occasionally in the course of my daily life. Is it Alzheimer's or is this just normal? And that's my question. What's Alzheimer's and what's normal?
It's really tough, but most people say that they forget a name, but it comes to them later when they can't do anything about it.
Yes.
And that's sort of a hallmark of normal forgetting. But with Alzheimer's disease, it's a huge degree of difference. For example, you forget that you forget. And that makes it also more difficult. It also doesn't start easily. I mean, it doesn't start on Tuesday. If it just starts on Tuesday, it's not Alzheimer's disease. And it affects other aspects than memory. It's bigger than memory. So that some people notice that they can't do their jobs or can't do cooking the way they used to. Some families say she just isn't herself. She may be more apathetic. She may be more withdrawn. Some people get irritable and frustrated because they're trying so hard to remember and keep things in order, and they just can't. So it's different than the kind of forgetting where we lose our keys and we can retrace our steps.
Right.
If you've lost recent memory with Alzheimer's disease, you don't remember where you were last. So you can't go back and look for your keys.
Once you get to a certain point in life, the first time you forget, everybody gets really frightened. And what families would tell me and what they would sometimes finally tell me is that these are people who had bad memories all of their lives. They just got excited when they finally got to 65. So we have to be careful in reassuring people who have what we would call normal forgetfulness.
Alzheimer's disease is now such a known entity in our population that now people who begin to have problems with word recall and so forth, which usually happens to people in their 40s and 50s and is a normal accompaniment of aging change over time, now everyone is concerned that this is Alzheimer's disease. Whereas the kinds of changes that occur in the majority of people who will get AD, which is after age 70 or so, these early changes in your 40s to 50s, especially when they don't interfere, other than embarrassing you, as you mentioned before, when they don't interfere with your everyday life, they are not the harbinger. It is true that the very, very earliest symptoms of Alzheimer's are difficult to differentiate from normal aging change. But one of the things that helps us to do that is awareness of what's normal, what's not, asking people what's normal, what's not, and having your family members and your friends understand the difference between forgetting a name occasionally, which is normal, and it's normal because I do that all the time, and something which really begins to interfere with your everyday function.
Well, that brings me to a point I definitely wanted to make, which is if you do have a loved one who you feel is exhibiting symptoms that aren't normal, one of the places to get help is the Alzheimer's Association. They have a hotline, which is 1-800-272-3900. And everyone at the association, these are people who are going through or have gone through what you're going through. And they can refer you to support groups, research centers, doctors in your area. The help is there 24/7. But even if you think you've identified a problem, and even if you have a wonderful resource like the Alzheimer's Association, what happens if your loved one is adamant that there is nothing wrong? There's no problem. How do you handle that?
That happens a lot. And sometimes it's because of the apathy, the loss of initiative, the inability to organize. They just may not be able to get themselves to a doctor, but often they're very scared of the outcome. They may be afraid that some control or independence will be taken away. And a lot of families have found that different things work. Sometimes they say, I'm concerned, it's my problem, would you go for me? And some people will do it. Sometimes they say, well, when we get to be our age, we should both go in, it's time for a general physical. And then some families find that if they tell the person, well, you know, you've been complaining about loss of energy or fatigue or not being interested, why don't you go in and get that checked out?
Right. Now, why are you laughing, Steve?
Well, I remember when we were first trying to find ways to bring patients in who either were afraid or in some cases simply did not recognize that they had it, which is actually part of the disease itself. I was in my office and the door opened and a woman brought her mother in and sort of pushed her mother in the door and said, Mom's here to see you. She has a memory problem, but she thinks she's here for a breast exam, and close the door.
Good luck.
True story.
Whatever works.
Yes.
Right?
Well,
Whatever
for
works.
them, it worked.
Yeah, well, that's great. Now, listen, we have some more questions in the audience. Let me see. We have Brian. Brian, right here. Go ahead. What's your question?
I'm wondering what medications are available for either early or late stages Alzheimer's residents currently, and what are your hopes for the future?
Well, we have 3 medications in the same class. They are medications that boost a certain kind of chemical in the brain that we know is impaired in Alzheimer's, and they clearly show an effect over time of either slowing the clinical progression or helping to change or delay some kinds of symptoms. There also is a new medication, a different kind of medication that's just been approved for Alzheimer's disease in the more severe stages, in the moderate to severe, according to the Food and Drug Administration's way of categorizing things. So we now have, or shortly will have, 4 medicines out on the market which are largely symptomatic. The next step is to find the medications that directly attack the fundamental changes in the brain of the disease. They are the ones that we would call disease modifying, the ones that would actually try to slow down the progression of the disease by halting its progress in the brain. And hopefully we'll have ones that are powerful enough that they would stop the disease in its tracks, and even, assuming they were safe enough, to prevent the disease from emerging in people who are in the age of risk.
Now we have another question from Brian. Is that you?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
As a caregiver, what suggestions do you have for caregivers that may be overwhelmed or exhausted or close to being burned out? And is there life after caregiving?
Well, I can say one thing, which is you should be overwhelmed and exhausted, because it is it's an overwhelming, exhausting thing that you're dealing with. And I know how on the airplanes they helpfully say, in the event of an emergency, if the oxygen mask drops down, please put yours on first and then put one on the person that needs your help. It's the same thing. You are in a perpetual emergency as a caregiver. So first you need to take care of yourself so that you'll be able to take care of the person you love. Anyone else on that?
Actually, we have a number of suggestions that we say to caregivers who say what you say. And the first one is to give yourself permission to not be perfect. Most of us are imperfect. And most of us are imperfect at caregiving. You can't be right all the time. You can't be correct all the time. It's a big, tough job. Caregivers talk about this being an unpredictable disease, unpredictable week by week, day by day, even sometimes hour by hour. So don't be so hard on yourself. Tell yourself that caregiving is difficult. That means you have a right to ask for help. Sometimes caregivers get in trouble because they don't want to accept help. They want to do it themselves.
They also have to, I think, learn to lower their standards. We had another social worker that used to talk about good enough for now solutions and giving yourself credit for getting through a day or acknowledging when there's a good day and a bad day. And but saying this was a good day or this was a good moment can really help.
And things like forgiving yourself when things go awry. Even the best caregiver who has it all together, there are going to be times when you get angry, when you yell at the person, when you lose patience. Know that these are all normal kinds of responses, and just to pick yourself up and to go on from there. We have caregivers who say even thinking about things that make them feel ashamed afterwards. Again, this is normal kind of responses. So forgiving yourself, setting priorities in terms of getting things done.
No one can do this job themselves. I actually think one of the reasons support groups have done so well since the advent of their sort of coming of age with this disease is that everybody has a million problems, and when they make their mistake that they have to forgive themselves for, and they say, well, what could I have done to not confronted him? What could I have done that would have made this go more smoothly? It's all the support group people who have the ideas that have been incredibly creative that when they discuss them, you find out, well, yeah, I never thought of that. These are great ideas. They don't so much come from the professional community, or at least they didn't in the first 10 years or so of the support groups getting organized. It's other caregivers who come up with incredibly clever ways of dealing with or avoiding problems or smoothing the way, along with getting help from other people to take care of the person who has the disorder.
Yeah, some of you may have been old enough to remember Jackie Gleason, but Jackie Gleason's line was, "It's bigger than both of us, Alice." And I think that dealing with Alzheimer's is so complex, and people tend to give you very simple, well, if you just did this.
Yeah.
And there is no if you just did. Any one thing is only going to work for a while, and sometimes the best caregivers, it's still things don't work. You can do the best job you want, and things still don't come out the way you anticipated.
And I think that's part of the value of support groups. What we say is that the person who gives you a suggestion may not work for you, but it may give you an idea of something else to try and to make it okay. Many of the things that come out in support groups almost seem off the wall. You're not going to find it in a textbook, but they work. And as long as you say, protect the dignity and the safety of the person you're working with, it's okay. That's sort of our motto.
And can I just say also about the support groups, because we saw this in the film with Harry and Gladys, what a just relief it is to be able to sit with other people and talk about it. Whether they come up with a solution or they don't come up with a solution, you're not alone. And I think that, is just one example. You have to be able to look outside yourself, and God knows there's a lot of people wanting to help. We have another question here from Mary. Yes, go ahead, Mary.
How can I get my mother to give up the car keys?
There are as many ways as there are people in this audience. Some people find that if the doctor says, while you're adjusting to the medication, it might be a good idea for you to stop driving. In other words, not saying that you're never going to be able to drive again, not saying that you're a bad driver, but just saying we don't know what this medicine might do, so it's good for you to stop driving for a while. Other families have had to resort to taking the distributor cap off, shaving down the car keys, putting the car in the shop, or moving the car to another location so that it can't be found or it was stolen. I have found that anybody with Alzheimer's can figure out a response to each one of those, including I knew a man who went out and bought another car when his kids moved the car.
Same thing.
You put it in the shop, they go and get it out of the shop. You have a doctor say, you're taking your driver's license away, and they say, well, I don't need a driver's license to drive. I know how to drive. And they keep going. So, I think you have to be persistent, and you have to find what works for you. But again, that's why you go to a support group.
We have another question from Mary.
My question pertains to finances. How do you get a loved one to turn over the finance to someone who's capable of taking care of them when they're in denial as to they're not the same person as they once was. For example, you check the checkbook entry and they have paid the same bill 3 or 4 times.
Unless the person has been judged incompetent by the court. It's sometimes very hard to do that if you can't talk them into it. Saying to them, let me help you do this, maybe letting them, you oversee the financial piece, but let them write the checks. Say, Mom, you know, this is a big job for you. Why don't you just write the checks or sign the checks and I can take care of this piece for you? Or saying, you know, I'm really concerned about how much work this is. And the piece about like taking away the driver's license or the keys, do it for me. It doesn't always work, but sometimes if you say, do it for me. What we also find is that sometimes people really want to give up those kinds of things and almost need permission to do it. So you have to figure out how to do this so that they maintain their dignity.
Some families also have been a little more devious. For example, you can have the bills mailed to another address. Have the bills sent to another address so that they don't keep repaying the same ones or leaving them around. Just always make sure that you keep mail coming to the house because nobody wants to get no mail. So it's important to do that. And other ways that you can do it is trying to intercept the bills, but that's a little harder.
The other thing about mail coming to the house, you don't want them sending off a check to every bogus organization under the sun. So if they've been used to paying bills and handling money, you also need to be aware of that as well. In small towns, sometimes you can work with the bank and help them work with you. And other places, it's not as easy.
One of my favorite quotes is Lisa's, which is, when you've met one Alzheimer's family, you've met one Alzheimer's family. So not only are people very different, but different levels of severity of thinking problems call for different kinds of solutions. So very early on, as Edna said, you'd like to be able to get things into fiscal shape so that you can help identify where things are. In addition, the idea that you can help someone as opposed to take over, or, you know, you can show me how you do this because I have a lot of the same kinds of bills and so forth to pay. Let me see how you organize this. Let me help you, but you can teach me how you do it, is very effective for someone who has mild disease as opposed to more severe disease. We talked about the fact that there's a difference in how much people recognize the fact that they have a memory change or not, and many people never recognize that they have a problem. Sometimes it's due to fear, sometimes it's actually the disease and the fact that the disease works in the parts of the brain that help provide us with insight into knowing when we are making mistakes or not. If we don't identify the disease and if we don't start early, or if we whisper about it, know something's wrong, but delay taking people to the doctor, what we do is rob people of the ability to make their own decisions about their future, not just how they'd like to have which of their daughters, it's usually daughters and daughters-in-law, who helps them to take care of their financial affairs and so forth, but also what they'd like to do before they can't appreciate it as much, where they might like to travel, who they'd like to call and make peace with after being angry at their brother after all these years, who's going to get the diamond stud earrings that is going to have to go to either one daughter or the other, what other sorts of things they would like to pass on to people. We rob people of their own self-determination if we whisper about this until things get so severe that you can't ignore it. So one of our calls for identifying the problem and seeing someone early is to allow people both that dignity and the ability to enjoy life and make their own decisions while they can make it, rather than wait till later and have them all trying to guess, what would Mom would have liked us to do here? What do you think she would have done? We could avoid that if we don't wait 2, 3, 4 years before saying, okay, we need to go see a doctor and we need to get this defined.
You know, a lot of these great answers. As you say, there are a million answers because there are a million different forms of these problems. One great resource that you can go to find more information about this is at the Forgettting website. It's beautifully laid out. It's easy to navigate, which is on pbs.org. And it's full of a ton of relatively simple answers to these very difficult questions. One of the difficult situations we saw in the documentary, the McKenna family, with their mom and being very supportive and loving, and Isabel being fairly unresponsive. And also we saw the Noonan family dealing with Fran expressing love and affection, and in that case she was actually quite sort of almost violent in her response. How do you handle those frustrating situations where who is this person that you're communicating with, and are you able to communicate with them?
Well, first, you don't stop visiting. I think it's important to stay connected to your relative. Second, I think you need to be a little bit more hypersensory rather than hyperverbal. You know, visits become a lot more like you saw with the McKennas, stroking her hair, gentle teasing, the kind of teasing that goes on in the family all the time. I loved Helen's comment about, you know, I'm here, I'm your favorite daughter. You know, I mean, families have to do what's comfortable. I've seen couples in visits in the nursing home where they're both reading the newspaper together because that's what makes the person in the nursing home feel more comfortable, or winding yarn together, or watching kids on a playground. Something that reminds people of their connections to each other. The other thing you can do is bring in props, scrapbooks that might trigger memory. Though I have to say, I had one man who had Alzheimer's disease, and his wife got real frustrated one day and real angry and upset and was irritable and all that stuff. And he said, maybe it's time for us to look at your scrapbook. You know? I mean, I think that people sometimes need some handle to have a visit. And also you can recognize sometimes it's not a good time to visit and come back later when the person's better able to enjoy it. But you can also trigger some memories with some conversations. And most families have sort of a familiar way of bantering or talking that tends to trigger some appropriate social behavior in their relative. And that's important.
One of the terrific things that Harry said in his commentary when talking about the disorder, and when Gladys would have difficulties or say something that was kind of out of sorts, he'd say, you know, I know this is the disease talking, this is not Gladys. One of the things that makes it so hard is when the same voice, sometimes the same intonation, the same face, says things or does things that are at odds with what they've been like over the past 30 or 40 years. And it's very useful to be able to say, I need to remember this is the disease doing that, and she doesn't modulate things the same way she did in the past. It's immensely useful for letting a lot of things go by that otherwise we sit and we say, why did he respond so poorly when I said this? It should have made him happy, and instead somehow it seemed to have made him sad. It's because they cannot modulate now the same way they would have done in the preceding decades.
Now, something I don't want to miss out on here, because we've spoken so much about this, the personal aspect of this tragedy, but the other thing that I think all of us here have experienced over the last, say, 10 years, is that more and more and more of the people we know either have this disease or know someone who has this disease. Is that just coincidence? Is that just because that's what we're focused on?
Well, I think there are two things going on, and we have to recognize them as being distinct. One is we have more awareness of it. Thank goodness we have more and more awareness. We know more about the disease. We're starting to come up with treatments, which is wonderful. And so people are getting diagnosed that maybe wouldn't have gotten diagnosed before. The other thing is the numbers are going way, way up. We are living longer than we've ever lived. This is a disease that's been around since as long as humans have, thousands and thousands of years. But only now are we living long enough in great enough numbers that we're statistically it's becoming important. It's becoming not just a family tragedy, it's becoming a social tragedy.
Yeah. The good news is that we're more aware of it, but the bad news is more of us are getting it.
Yeah.
There are a lot of aspects of Alzheimer's that we haven't covered here, and that's a good thing, because this is a conversation that needs to continue. As Harry Fugit says, the future is not someplace I'm madly dashing to get to, but it's going to get to me whether or not I'm ready for it, and I've just got to try to be ready for it when it gets here. We hope that this conversation has helped. Don't forget the phone number for the Alzheimer's Association, 1-800-272-3900. Thank you so much to our panel, to our extraordinary families, and to our studio audience. To those of you watching at home, Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. We can only defeat it if we face it together. Thank you.
MetLife Foundation is proud to support this important program, helping people to better understand, prepare for, and meet the challenges of this urgent health issue. MetLife Foundation,